Tired of everyone telling you to find your passion, but no one telling you how? Welcome to the Korean Connection, and I'm your host, Korean, an attorney with a passion for empowering others to use their many talents and skills towards a path of self-discovery and alignment. Join me as I share my personal stories, professional insights, and practical tips, and how you can connect the dots between what you're great at and turning your passions into purpose. Let's connect. Push it to the left, make it go no more. Make it like no, I'm coming back home. I'm trying to roll all of my you. I'ma be the greatest, write my name in the stone. Write my name in the stone. Yeah, I'm coming back home. Yeah, I'm coming back home. Write my name in the stone. Cause I'm coming back home. Cause I'm coming back home. Welcome back to the Korean Connection. So the jury has the case, and they have a tall order to prove. What is it that the jury must prove in order to convict Diddy of these charges? Now, let's talk about first, what is he charged with? Just a recap. He's charged with a count of RICO conspiracy. He's charged with 2 counts of sex trafficking, and he's charged with 1 count of commercial prostitution, okay? And in order to convict Diddy of any of these 5 elements, they first have to prove the predicate charges, right? So they have to first prove these underlying charges in order to get to the RICO conspiracy or to prove the sex trafficking in order to really make it a RICO case. So one of the things that they have to prove, one of the elements they can choose from, is the drugs, right? The prosecution presented testimony about all the drugs that Diddy staff members used or traveled with or trafficked with in order to produce these freak-offs, right? And some of those drugs we heard about: ketamine, cocaine, MDMA, ecstasy, Xanax. We heard from his staff members how drugs was an integral part of the freak-offs. We also heard about the arson. Arson is one of the elements. And we heard testimony regarding Kid Cudi and the blowing up of the car. Bribery is another one of the elements. And the prosecution also presented evidence about the bribery, how that video, he tried to bribe the security guard for $100,000. Another one is the kidnapping. We heard testimony from the prosecution about the kidnapping of the individual for the purposes of giving them a lie detector test when jewelry was missing from one of the locations. Another one of the elements that we have to prove is labor by force. Now, we heard from Cassie and Jane that they were forced into doing these sex acts under the threat of violence or intimidation. Another one that they have to prove is kidnapping again. Cassie also testified about being kidnapped and being held against her will and being forced into performing these sex acts. So those are some of the elements that the prosecution has to prove. And remember, guys, they don't have to prove all of these. They literally just have to prove 2. So if they wanted to just choose the bribery, we know that they were successfully able to prove the $100,000. They heard testimony that Sean Puffy Combs actually gave the security guard $100,000 in order to cover up that video. So that was bribery in itself. We also heard about bribery from Cassie's own mother, who talked about how Diddy extorted her for $20,000 in an attempt to not release her child's sex tapes that would obviously ruin her career. So bribery was one of those elements. Again, the prosecution doesn't need to prove all 8 elements. They just need to prove 2. And I think the prosecution has done an excellent job at least proving. I think they've proved probably all of these elements, but certainly they're only required to prove 2, and I think they've done just that. How will they prove the sex trafficking charge? The sex trafficking charge, the 2 counts belong to Jane and Cassie, right? And the sex trafficking is essentially the forced labor portion of it, where Cassie and Jane recounted events where they did not want to participate in this freak-offs, and that the beatings that they received when they refused in order to do that, that is the forced labor. That is a sex trafficking. The commercial for the prostitution, the commercial prostitution, We heard from some of the escorts who testified and talked about how they were paid for these services and that they were flown out from various states in order to perform and to participate in these freak-offs. So the government has proven, has presented the evidence in order to sufficiently align with these charges. But what will the jury do? Will the jury convict? We will find out. The greatest love story ever? That is what the defense said this case is all about. Now, is it a smart strategy on the defense? Now, look, the defense doesn't have a lot to hang their hat on in this case, right? In fact, as you can see, they decided to call 0 witnesses in defense of this case. And so one of the strategy that the defense is taking is to minimize. And they do that by saying, look, we don't have to do all this hoopla and carrying all these experts. The prosecution is simply doing way too much for a case like this. And so the defense has painted this picture as this toxic love story, this love triangle between Jane and Diddy and Cassie. But is it an effective strategy? Now, look, the greatest love story, I think that's a stretch. I think the defense attorney is doing an amazing job at minimizing, keeping it light, right? You wanna portray the freak-offs as just sort of some celebrity swingers, underground celebrity swingers club, and I get that. But to coin this as the greatest love story, I think he's entering dangerous territory. Now, look, the jury and the public cannot unsee Cassie getting beaten, brutally on that video. We cannot unhear how she's forced to have sex with multiple men, while experiencing a UTI or having sores in her mouth or being forced to do it while she's on her menstruation. To coin this as the greatest love story, I think the defense, in trying to minimize the trauma that these victims were trying to portray or the seriousness that the prosecution was trying to give in this case, I think he may have gone a little bit too far on trying to keep it too light, right? Because at the end of the day, you do have to deal with the grips of the traumatic things that, the jurors watched. Hours of sex freak-offs videos, hours of brutality at the hands of this man, and to sort of played off as this toxic love story of just with a hint of domestic violence, I think is playing into dangerous territory and may backfire on the defense case. What happens in deliberations? Now, what happens when the jury goes back in that room and is now given all of the evidence that the prosecution has laid out for them to consider? What happens in that room? Having done jury trials and getting feedback from jurors about what happens in that deliberation room, the first thing that's going to happen is that the jurors are just going to talk freely about just their feelings. There's their first impressions as to what is left with them after hearing all of the evidence. Look, it's been a long trial. The prosecution, presented 29 witnesses, the defense 0, right? And, sometimes as lay jurors, you underestimate as an attorney how easily people forget information, how the attention span of jurors are so short that a defense attorney's closing arguments can completely wipe out the memory of hour-long testimonies that was presented by the prosecution. And it's the prosecution's job in order to convince them that they have proven their case. So if the prosecution hasn't done that and the jury still have questions lingering in their mind, those questions are the first things that's going to be at the discussion once they enter into those rooms. And so they're going to have free conversation. Well, I still have lingering questions about this. How does the prosecution prove this? And this is probably before they even get an opportunity to read through the actual jury instructions, right? Because on Monday, what's going to happen happen, the judge is going to give the jury the instructions that they need to follow. But for right now that the jury has a case, all they're thinking about are questions, things that are confusing to them, things that they need to tie up loose ends. And so they're going to be relying on each other to connect those dots that they may have missed during the course of the trial. There's going to be jurors discussion talking about, oh, but remember when they said this is what I thought it mean. And there's going to be that open discussion. After the judge provides them with the jury instruction, now they're actually going to have to look at the legal language of the law and then look at the facts and make a determination as to whether or not the legal definitions of what the prosecution is trying to prove has been met by the evidence. So, did the prosecution actually prove arson? Did the prosecution actually prove kidnapping? Did the prosecution actually prove bribery? These are the underlying predicate charges that they must get to in order to prove a conspiracy charge. So that's going to be the first line of order for them to decide those 8 predicate elements. Did the prosecution meet at least 2 of those? And I think that's where they're going to be starting. That's going to be the starting point for this jury and before they enter deliberations on the conspiracy and the trafficking and so forth. The defense just need one. Okay? Look, the prosecution has to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And it's a tall order, right? Beyond a reasonable doubt is incredibly difficult to prove because it's beyond any reasonable doubt. So all the defense has to do in this case is to create doubt. And I think they've done a great job at doing that throughout the case. But let's focus a little bit about what the prosecution has to do. The prosecution has to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt in order to get a conviction. All 12 jurors have to say guilty on every count, right? And that's no easy feat. This RICO conspiracy charge, it requires a co-conspirator. If the prosecution has not successfully convinced the jurors that Diddy's staff members were co-conspirators in order to pull off this big enterprise of a RICO crime organization, which is what they're trying to insinuate by, Bad Boy Entertainment. That's what it truly is, an illegal enterprise. They have to show that, there's a co-conspirator that was in agreement to perform these illegal acts in conjunction with Diddy. For the jury, the public may not view this case like the prosecution does in thinking that Diddy's staff members, who are just employees, right? They can be similarly likened to the Cassies and the Jane, where they are similarly under threats of or fear. But certainly the defense can't say that, right? They can't say that, his staff members are afraid of him. That would obviously play into the prosecution's theory of their case, of his coercion of violence and threats and so forth. So what they want to show, though, is that they're just mere employees, just carrying out, his desires. They didn't believe that what they were doing were criminal, nor were they, conspiring with him in order to carry out this enterprise of criminal activity. Yes, he uses drugs. Yes, he likes to have sex. Yes, as his personal assistant, we assist in getting those things for him like any celebrity would have, right? They have personal assistants that dress them, personal assistants that carry their clothes, that fly, their stylist that comes with them. These are just all staff members that are hired to do the work that they're hired to do. So to call them co-conspirators in this organized plan may be a stretch for the prosecution. And I think that is certainly what the defense attorney is harping on, that, look, this doesn't pass muster or meet the threshold to be a RICO case. This is not, a mob boss, with all the underlings that's carrying out his dealings. This is simply a businessman with lots of employees that seeks to just ensure that his day runs smoothly. And these are the things that he likes, and these are the things that they effectuate as a part of his request. No force, no coercion, no threats, no violence, just employment. And so if the defense is successfully able to prove that these staff members were not in agreement with Diddy, I think the prosecution is going to have a hard time proving the RICO charges, which is the bigger charge that carries the longer sentence, which involves life imprisonment. The defense, on the other hand, has a much easier job. Now, it's not easy for the defense attorney. Obviously, they carry the burden of someone's life, the determination of someone, representing them to the fullest to make sure that that they've done the best job to make sure this person doesn't end up, in jail, in prison for the rest of their life. So obviously, that's a big burden. But the defense job in this case is so much easier than the prosecution. And that's why you see the prosecution, they have to be so formalistic in the way in which they present the evidence. You won't see a prosecution being sarcastic and joking or showing any sort of levity in presenting the argument because they are the government. It's serious. They know what they're asking the jury to do at the end of the day. To ask the jury to convict someone of a crime is no small feat. And in jury selection, prosecutions, they spend a long time with the jury in talking specifically about that portion. Because morally, we know a lot of people have dissonance about, religious-wise, judging other people. Do you have an issue judging someone? Will you be able, should the prosecution prove their case, will you be able to follow the law and convict if you find that the prosecution has proven the case? And so during jury selection, a lot of time is spent with the jury, getting them familiar with this idea of convicting at the end. And they have to say, sometimes when I'm a prosecutor, I go through and I poll my juries. Mr. So-and-so, Mr. John Doe, if I prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt, will you follow the law and convict? And I go around and I make sure that every single one of my jurors say, yes, I will convict, because they have to get used to the idea of convicting someone, right? You can't take religion, cannot be taken into account. Your feelings can't be taken into account. You have to follow the scriptures of the law. And so the prosecution always, at the very onset of the case, very painstakingly get the jurors in the mindset of, at the end of the day, I'm going to be asking you to do one thing. The one thing I'm going to be asking you to do is to return a verdict of guilty on all counts, right? And, remember as well, the jurors are not able to consider, the sentencing. That is strictly for the judge. All the jurors have to decide is guilt or innocence, right? So a defense attorney's plea to, don't ruin his life, this means life imprisonment, certainly is something for the jury to consider in returning a verdict of guilty. But the judge will tell you that the sentencing, the amount of years that is determined that goes along with the conviction, that is solely in the judge's discretion. The judge is the one that imputes the sentence. He determines the amount of years someone spends behind bars after evaluating all the evidence and what the verdict that the jury has come by. So the defense in this case, all they have to do is to poke holes, attack the credibility of these witnesses, show that the prosecution is doing above and beyond what is required, and it's not necessary, that they are out for blood for someone that's just living their life, someone who's just a self-made millionaire, someone who has increased diversity, who has impacted culture, who has made all these major contributions to our lives, our music, our lifelong playlist that we play, right? He has been an integral part of that. And now to take that away from him by returning a verdict of guilty, you can see why the defense is going to be harping and playing on the heartstrings of the jurors. But the defense role is solely just to poke hole. The defense attorney only needs to convince one juror, right? While the prosecution has to convince all 12, the defense attorney just need one person to hold out. If one person holds out and he says, you know what, I don't believe, the prosecution's theory, I side with the defense that this is just some underground swingers club that sometimes get a little bit out of hand, and, he slaps around his girlfriend, he's a piece of, SHIT to his lovers, but does this require him to have life imprisonment? If one juror, strongly feels this way, it's a hung jury, right? And what happens with a hung jury? No conviction. The prosecution has to decide whether or not they want to try the case again, or reduce charges, or perhaps rather than going through this whole trial, which I can't see the prosecution doing again, if there's an acquittal or not acquittal, but if there's a hung jury, they'll probably make an offer, which Diddy will probably have to consider whether or not he want to take an offer or take his chances again, right? Since a hung jury is very strong indication that the prosecution will not be able to wasn't able to prove their case the first time, and more than likely will not be able to prove their case a second time when all the evidence is stale and all the testimony is already out there. I don't see the government doing that. So that might be, a strategy for the defense. But again, the defense case is much easier burden. In fact, they have no burden, but they have a very much easier task to just convince one person as opposed to the prosecution's duty of convincing all 12. Was calling no witness a fatal decision by the defense? Look, a few things to consider, right? One is, who did he call, right? At first, I thought that he would perhaps call an expert witness to combat, the testimony from the prosecution's expert witness that talks about sex trafficking and the signs of sex trafficking and coercion. But in retrospect, I can see why that probably wouldn't have gone a long way for the defense, to have an expert to sort of come and say, no, that's not coercion. It probably wouldn't play very well. It probably will come off as not credible for an expert to come and talk about how, the signs of what are the signs of a victim, or what makes a person stay or be reluctant to run away, or, why they felt threatened in order to not leave. I don't think, in retrospect, perhaps calling a witness probably wouldn't have done much. An expert witness wouldn't have done much for that. But the question remains, why no witnesses at all? Were there no employees that he could have called in defense of him? Now, think about that, guys, right? For the staff members that were called on the prosecution's case to testify, they had to be granted immunity to testify, right? Because what would his staff members come and testify to? All they will be testifying to is essentially what Diddy's charged with. A load of criminal activity that they'll be admitting to being complicit in. If they don't have immunity from the government to testify about the things that they've done, and they can deny it, that's one thing. But if they deny it, they're going to be subject to cross-examination. It just wouldn't have played out well for him to call witnesses. But it also shows, to an extent, no one is in his corner at this point, right? No one is coming in defense of Diddy. With all the people that he knows, with all the popularity that he has, with all the strings and connection that Diddy, bad boy, has earned him, it's pretty telling that the defense didn't have not one witness to call, right? Not his mother, not his child, not a correct, they could have called character witnesses. I mean, the prosecution certainly called his character into question. They painted him as a complete monster. They could have had one of his children come and testify about, their relationship with him and how they've come to know their father, or, speak to the character of the man that the defense is saying that we all know and love, right? There must have been someone who wasn't so caught up in the freak-outs that could have came and gave some sort of testimony in that regard. But they called no one. And I think that's pretty telling to the defense case. One, I know it's a part of their strategy to keep it, to minimize the trauma, minimize the need to even, seriously respond to any of the prosecution's allegation. That's certainly a part of the defense strategy, to keep it light. Look, they're doing way too much, and it's not worth our energy, because this is all this case is worth. It's domestic violence at best, right? And so that's the defense strategy. But to call no witnesses, you know, it not a complete surprise in cases that the defendant doesn't testify, but for the defense to call not a single witness in a case of this magnitude is risky. Is risky because, you kind of leave the jury wanting to hear something to combat the 29 witnesses that the prosecution, introduced into evidence. You want someone to come and say, no, this is still the man that we have known all our lives. This is the man that has the key to New York City. This is the man who has given us, culture and music, and we've adored and renamed himself Dr. Love, someone to come in aid and defense to sort of reassure us that, all these bad things that the prosecution outlined for us, that's not the case. This is not who he is when he's not in the courtroom, when he's at home with his family and his 6 children who's sitting behind him in the courtroom. We weren't able to hear from anyone. And, I think that that's going to be sort of a fatal error on the part of the defense to not present any witnesses on this case, not even character witnesses. I definitely don't think that calling staff members would have been smart. They would have been testifying under immunity by the prosecution anyway, which the defense would have then in turn saying that they can't be trusted because they're granted an immunity, right, for testifying about the things that the prosecution seeks to elicit from them. And, and if they testified outside of that, they would have just become complicit in admitting to committing criminal acts with Sean Puffy Combs. So it wouldn't have been a good situation either way. It certainly would have been a win-win situation for the defense to call any staff members on his behalf. But it definitely leaves you thinking as to all the reasons why they couldn't call someone to testify on his behalf. On Monday, the judge's instruction to the jury will be to consider facts over feelings. Look, there's a lot of feelings that goes into this case. Outside of the evidence that the long drawn out evidence that the prosecution has presented, there's a lot of feelings that you still have to deal with, right? And sometimes feelings can't be resolved by testimony, right? People still got to be secure at the end of the day with the decision that they're going to be making to convict and to send Diddy away potentially for the rest of his life. The judge's instruction to the jury on Monday will be, listen, you cannot consider your feelings, but only the facts, right? And, the defense in this case wants to harp on, Diddy's family, right? Wants to harp on the long sentence, how his life will be essentially over, that he has a newborn baby, that he has all these things that he has to live for. They mentioned that, all the attributes that he's presented to us, all the gifts he's given the world, right? They're going to be playing on the feelings, your feelings, that doesn't consider any of the facts. Now, remember, closing arguments, the defense, the prosecution, they're able to, use not necessarily opinions so much, but they can tie the evidence together in a way in which they view it, right? So they don't necessarily have to, they can definitely play on the emotions, especially that is definitely a defense attorney's bread and butter. It's a play on the emotions of the jurors. But the emotions are not facts. And you will see over on Monday, once the judge gives the jury the instruction in saying, listen, you cannot consider your feelings. You cannot feel bad for this person. You have to do the right thing. You have to follow the law. And so as a prosecutor, one of the things that I did in preparing for a trial, the best prosecutors always start backwards. You always want to start with your summation. And in starting with your summation, you want to be able to sum up the entire case, right? You want to know what's the lasting impression you're going to be leaving on a juror. And in order to sum up the case, you want to also have the jurors consider the jury instructions that they're going to be hearing. So as a prosecutor, what I'll do, I will look at the jury instructions, literally the physical words that the judge is going to be saying to the jury. I want to make sure that I am aligning the jury instruction to every single facts and details, because I want to tie that up in a nice, neat bow for the jury. I don't want the jury to even have to think too much when they go back in the deliberation room. The prosecution, it's their job to do all the thinking for the jury. You want to tie it up in a nice, neat bow with the jury instructions, with the evidence, and say, look, we've done above and beyond. And I think that's what the prosecution has done in proving all 8 elements. They didn't stop at the 2 that they were required to stop for those predicate elements of proving arson and bribery and kidnapping. And they weren't obligated to prove all 8, but by the way in which they presented the evidence, because they knew that the defense was going to take this as just a light domestic violence love triangle kind of case, they went above and beyond in order to prove all 8 elements of the predicate. And now they said, look, jurors, it's up to you to just choose 2. Any 2 you choose, we have proven this case beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think the prosecution has done an excellent job at doing that during their closing arguments. Will Diddy be convicted? I think yes. Honestly, I think the prosecution, they definitely proved this case beyond a reasonable doubt. But it never fails to amaze me how forgetful juries can be. How the simplest little thing that can throw them off. Like when as a prosecutor, after you feel as though you've done your damnness to prove a case, sometimes the questions that the jurors have, you would have never guessed that is going to be what your case hinges on. That make a jury unable to convict a defendant, or or makes a case hung, right? That can't make a decision. But in this case, I think the prosecution has done an amazing job of proving probably all of the 8 predicate elements of this case through the testimony. Now, look, it's all going to come down to the credibility of the witnesses. Do the jury believe the witnesses? Were they credible? I think that Cassie came off completely empathetic and credible. I don't think that the defense attorney, in coining her experience, her traumatic experience, as the greatest love story. I mean, he talked about, some of the text messages I read were some of the most beautiful messages I've read in my entire life. And I'm just like, that is where you're going to go with it? The fact that these women were torn because they were so in love with him while being simultaneously exploited, to call that the greatest love story. I mean, that takes toxicity to the next level when you think about it. Like, which love story is that great? I've never, as a child, think of a love story where I'm being beaten and dragged across the floor and forced to have sex with multiple people, even while I'm in discomfort or on my menstrual. So to coin that as, the greatest love story is going to be a hard feat. But I think the prosecution has proven this case. They've definitely proved all 8 elements. They've definitely proved the sex trafficking by Jane and by Cassie. I think they're inextricably intertwined. If they find for one, they're going to have to find for all. This case is an all or nothing. So if they convict on some things, they're probably going to have to convict on everything. And I don't see this case being a straight out acquittal. So I think he's going to be convicted. Whether or not he gets convicted on the RICO charges is really going to hinge on whether or not the jury believes that there were 2 co-conspirators, and that he's not just acting solely as a person and as an individual. That alone is not sufficient in order to prove the RICO charge. So it's going to come down to the credibility of the witnesses. But I think, all in all, I think the prosecution is going to get a conviction here. The defense in this case is harping on the fact that there's 8 men and 4 women on this jury. In my experience, men are more sympathetic to women under these circumstances than even the women are. And the reports from the women on the jurors when they were watching those freak-offs videos and watching those violent attacks on Cassie and Jane, they they were wincing. That information was not easily digestible by those women. And so, for the defense to sort of assume that these men were going to be acting in a very chauvinistic or viewing the evidence in a very chauvinistic way is very risky. I think the defense probably went too far with levity in trying to make this scenario lighter than it needs to be. I think they definitely could have acknowledged some of the seriousness of the prosecution's case without giving it that much, depth, to achieve their same purpose of minimizing, the prosecution's case is the strategy. But I think that the defense in this case, they're over relying on the fact of just the mere fact that there's 8 men. I think the evidence in this case is just hard to watch, to hear, to see in general, whether it's man or woman. And so they're going to have a really hard time, getting an acquittal on all of these charges. Thank you guys for connecting with me today. Don't forget to follow, like, and subscribe to my channel, The Kareen Connection. To connect with me, you can email me at thekareenconnection@gmail.com. And don't forget that sometimes your passion whispers before it roars. And if you're listening closely, the next episode might be where it gets louder. Let's connect. Push it to the